This lesson is all about reading poems, or what we call reading poetry. The two poems we're going to come across in this lesson are called, the first, The Daffodils, or what's commonly known as I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. The second poem is called My Heart Leaps Up, both written by William Wordsworth. By being exposed to these two poems, we'll be able to own our skills in how to read poetry. So the first thing we have to talk about is actually how to read poetry. So we're going to talk about how to read a poem and the art of reading a poem, and the two rules, the two golden rules to read a poem, so you'll be able to at the end appreciate the poem you read and be able to understand and then analyze the poem. So in the end, you'll be able to read, understand, and appreciate any poem you read and come across. The second objective is that you'll be able to paraphrase a poem and summarize it, stanza by stanza, and summarizing the whole poem. And then I'm going to move on to literary devices, what we call poetic devices or poetic diction. We're going to come across lots of these devices. We're going to talk about them, and how to locate them, and how to appreciate them, and the effect of these literary devices in the poem. And I'm going to move on to the form of the poem itself, and then we're going to discuss the meter of the poem. Then I'm going to move on to the themes that arise from these poems. In the end, you'll be able to understand how to write a poem, and how to read a poem, how to analyze it, and how to deconstruct the poem in the end to be able to appreciate it. The simplest definition of poetry is that it is what poets write. Of course, but that seems obvious enough, and yet there are those who would dispute the definition. Poetry, though, for those who dispute the definition, is a kind of spontaneous overflowing of the personality, which may be expressed in written words, but may also take the form of physical action, or more or less musical sound, or even just feeling. There's something to this, of course, and poets have always recognized it. It is a very old notion that the poet reaches down deep into himself to produce these poems, and that their place of origin is a mysterious well of creation within the mind or soul. In this sense of the term, poetry can be made by anyone at any time in a kind of solitary sensitivity session. But although we admit that there is some sort of truth in this definition, the meaning of the term that we will be employing what follows in terms of the lesson is much narrower. Whatever may be the origin of the poetic impulse, poetry for us consists of words, and what is more, of words that are arranged in a more or less ordinary and disciplined way. Other definitions of the term that similarly contain some sort of truth are that poetry is not truly poetry unless it praises, or unless it rouses to action, or unless it is written in rhyme, or unless it employs a specialized language that is called poetic diction. Our point here is that all of these definitions, and a dozen more of them that we might mention later, are too narrow. We are certainly that 9 times of 10 of you, or perhaps even 99% out of 100 of you, would agree with us that X was a poem and Y was not a poem, and that is fully sufficient for our purpose in the following lesson. Many people believe that they cannot read poetry, specifically lyric poetry, especially modern poetry. They think that it's often difficult, obscure, complex, and that it demands so much attention, so much work on the part that it is not worthwhile. We would like to say two things. First, poetry, specifically lyric poetry, even modern poetry, does not always demand as much work as you may think if you go about reading it in the right way. This is number one. Number two, It is often worth whatever effort you are willing to spend. We do not mean that you would not work on a poem. A good poem can be worked at, reread, and thought about over and over for the rest of your life. You will never stop finding new things in it, new pleasures and delights, and also new ideas about yourself and the world. We mean that the initial task of bringing a poem close enough to you to work on it is not as hard as you may have believed. There are actually few rules to know when you want to read a poem. For example, number one, the first rule to follow in reading a poem is to read it through without stopping. Whether you think you understand it or not, don't stop. This is the same rule that we suggest for many different kinds of texts, but it is more important for poem than it is for any other text. In fact, the trouble so many people seem to have in reading poems, specifically the difficult modern ones, stems from their awareness of this first rule of reading them. For example, when they face poems by, let's say, T.S. Eliot or Dylan Thomas or some other obscure modern poem, they plunge in with a will, but are brought up short by the first line or stanza. They do not understand it immediately and in its entirety, and they think they should. They puzzle over the words, try to unwind the complicated yarn of the syntax, and soon give up, concluding that, as they suspected, poetry is just too difficult for them. It is not only modern poems that are difficult. Many of the best poems in language are complicated and involved in their language and thought. Besides, many apparently simple poems have immense complexity under the surface. But any good poem, specifically a lyrical poem, has a unity. Unless we read all of it and all at once, we cannot comprehend its unity. We cannot discover, except possibly by accident, the basic feeling or experience that underlies it. In particular, the essence of a poem is almost never to be found in its first line, or even in its first stanza. It is to be found only in the whole, and not conclusively in any part. The second rule for reading lyrics is this: read the poem through again, but read it out loud. Again, the second rule for reading lyrics is this: read the poem through again, but read it out loud. We have suggested this before, and in the case of poetic drama, like for example Shakespeare's, it can happen as well. It is essential also that you will find, as you read the poem out loud, that the very act of speaking the words forces you to understand them better. You cannot glide over a misunderstood phrase or line quite so easily if you are speaking it. Your ear is offended by a misplaced emphasis that your eyes might miss. And the rhythm of the poem and its rhymes, if it has them, will help you to understand by making you place the emphasis where it belongs. Finally, you will be able to open yourself to the poem and let it work on you as it should. In the reading the poems, these first two suggestions are more important than anything else. We think that if readers who believe they cannot read poems would obey these rules first, they would have the little difficulty afterwards. For once you have apprehended the poem and its unity, even if this apprehension is vague, you can begin to ask it questions. And as with expository works, that is the secret of understanding. The questions you ask of an expository work are grammatical and logical. The questions you ask of a poem are usually rhetorical, though they may be also syntactical in terms of sentences or sentence structure. You do not come to terms with a poem, but you must discover the key words. You discover them not primarily by an act of grammatical discernment, however, but by an act of rhetorical discernment. Why do certain words pop out of the poem and stare you in the face? Is it because the rhythm marks them, or the rhyme, or are the words repeated? Do several stanzas seem to be about the same ideas? If so, do these ideas form any kind of sequence? Anything of this sort that you can discover will help you understand the poem better. In most good poems, specifically lyrical poems, there is some kind of conflict, sometimes two antagonists, either individual people or images or ideas are named, and then the conflict between them is described. If so, this is easy to discover, but often the conflict is only implied and not stated. For example, a large number of great lyric poems, perhaps even the majority of them, are about the conflict between life and death, between the beauty of transient things and triumph of eternity, but these words may not be even mentioned in the poem itself. One final piece of advice about reading poems. In general, readers of such works feel that they must know more about the authors and their times than they really have to. We put much faith in commentaries, biographies, and so on, but this may be only because we doubt our own ability to read. Almost everyone can read any poem, if he will go to work on it. Anything you discover about an author's life or times is valid and may be helpful, but a vast knowledge of the context of the poem is no guarantee that the poem itself will be understood. To be understood, it must be read over and over and over. Reading any great poem is a lifetime job. Not, of course, in the sense that it should go on and on throughout your lifetime, but rather that as a great poem, it deserves many return visits. And during vacations from a given poem, we may learn more about it than we realize. The poet, William Wordsworth. Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770. He died on April 23, 1850. He lost his parents at a young age and was separated from his sister for several years. Therefore, he considered he was educated in nature. When he was 20 years old, he moved to the Alps, where he explored this landscape in search of solace. For him, hostile environments were a source of inspiration, and later on a place of contemplation and healing. He lived in France for a while, got married and had a daughter. He was forced to abandon them when the French Revolution struck. He never saw his family again, as the letters from his wife were confiscated. He was reunited with his sister, with whom he remained most of his life. Together, they traveled to several places that feature in his poems. Among these travels is Tinterney Abbey, which we believe to be a representation of a harmonious pre-industrial past. The abbey made him feel insignificant but connected him to eternity. For him, the abbey in ruins represents the sublime. As he said, it was a metaphor for how nature is more powerful than man. In 1795, he met Samuel Taylor Coleridge, with whom he worked to save the ideas of Romanticism that were lost in the Revolution. Both moved to the countryside with their respective families to work on a collection of poems that would define the age, what they called the lyrical ballads. Wordsworth and Coleridge transformed poetry into an art that was focused on the ordinary individual, the unknown hero. It emphasized individual experience. The experience of the poem, The Daffodils, or as commonly known as I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, by William Wordsworth. The poem was based on a trip that Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy had. Yet it is interesting that he emphasizes how he wandered lonely. We can read Dorothy's account in her journal, dated April 5, 1802, where she said, I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and wreathed and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so merry, ever glancing, ever changing. The poem was published in 1807. I wandered lonely as a cloud, by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them dance, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Now that you've read the poem aloud at least twice, it's time now to start understanding the poem. The first step to understand the poem is to actually paraphrase it stanza by stanza. By paraphrasing, we mean is that you reword the poet's words in your own word. By doing so, you're trying to transition his words into your own words so you can really understand the poem by yourself. So I'm going to start with stanza 1 and then move on to stanza 2, and I'm going to leave you to do stanzas 3 and 4 for next time. After that, we're going to combine all the paraphrase for all the stanzas and summarize the whole poem. Let's start with the first stanza. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So you notice that the first stanza contains 6 lines and has actually 2 ideas. The first one is that it's saying that the speaker aimlessly walks alone, similar as a solitary cloud in the sky floating over hills and vales. Notice that in the first stanza, it's in the present tense, and then the poet shifts to the past tense. We're going to talk about that later. And then he continues and says, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Here he says that suddenly the speaker saw along a bustling row of daffodils. And then he continues and says, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Which means that they were near the lake and the trees, they flickered and shifted as they were blown by a zephyr. Zephyr is a very nice breeze. So that's the paraphrase of the first stanza. Notice that we have 2 to 3 ideas here. We can put them in 3 paragraphs or just 1 paragraph to signify the first paraphrase of the first stanza. Let's move on to the second stanza, where it says here, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched near in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. So what is he saying here is that the speaker is comparing the daffodils to the sparkling stars in our galaxy. The speaker noted how the flowers seem to go on perpetually alongside the bay. Perpetually means never-ending, unceasing. And then the speaker estimated that there were 10,000 daffodils, with their heads moving as if they were swaying with vitality and spirit. So there you are. These are the first 2 stanzas paraphrased for you. What I'd like to do is that I'd like you to continue with stanzas 3 and 4 and see how we can paraphrase them for next time.